Would you like to listen to a German magic spell or two? Now, that's not something that you would usually put together. Magic and Germans, they don't really go hand in hand, but there are old High German magic spells, the so-called Mersenburger Zaubersprüche. And they are remarkable in more than one way. For one thing, magic spells. And for another thing, they should not have survived. They are from the pre-Christian time of the Germans, and they are one of the, if not the only, surviving written text in Old High German, in the pre-Christian kind of German, because the people who came after the culture that used this kind of language had no interest whatsoever in preserving it. Their interest was quite the opposite. So the Christians who came, they wanted to destroy and eradicate and assimilate all of the culture that came before it, especially the religious texts. And so how did they survive? Curiously enough, they were found, that's the name, the Mersenburger Zaubersprüche, Mersenburg magic spells, in the town of Mersenburg, in a tome, a volume of literature, a book that was found in the cathedral of Mersenburg. And this book was a collection of the various sorts of prayers and kind of little, of course, deeply Christian spells that simple people used in certain situations. We still have a tradition to call on a specific saint to find car keys, lost car keys, for example. So this is not so unusual, even today, that people would collect those kind of spells. And in this, for whatever reason, two of these old High German spells survived. Now, they were first popularized, actually, in the 19th century by Jacob Grimm, one of the brothers Grimm, and his interest in something like that was evident, and he found it, and he edited it, and he published it for the first time. The actual age of these spells is much, much older. They go back to it's very difficult to date them, somewhere between the 2nd and the 10th century. It's a very small window of time. But no, probably they were written more towards the end of that period, sometimes in the 8th, 9th, or 10th century, and pretty soon after they were written down and put into this sort of collection, or maybe they were kept in memory, oral memory, for a while, until somebody eventually wrote them down. And originally they were kept in a church in the town of Fulda, another German town, and from there they made their way into this very important tome in the cathedral of Mersenburg, where it was kept for the next several hundred years. And I'm going to let you listen to these spells themselves so you can know what they might have sounded like.
Airis satsun idisi, satsun hera duoder, summa haft heftidun, summa heri litsidun, summa klubodun umbicunio vidi. Inspring haftbandun, införvigandun, inspring haftbandun, införvigandun. Fol ende vuodan furon si holza, du vard demo balderes folon sin fuotspirinkit. Tu biguol en sintkunt suna eras vister, tu biguol en freia fola eras vister, tu biguol en vuodan so hevola konda. Så se benrenki, så se bluotrenki, så se lidirenki. Benci bena, bluoci bluoda, litci geliden, så se gelimida sin.
So you have heard those two spells. The first spell was a spell to free somebody from binding, and the second spell to heal the injured foot of a horse. Now you will also have noticed perhaps that these sound all spells, so the incantation part is actually always towards the end. The first part is a situation that is being described, so for the people who used those spells, this would have been the first situation in which those spells were uttered, the most powerful use of those words. And if you wanted to use that spell properly, you probably would need this situation, to keep that in mind. In the first one, you have the situation of the EDC, and the EDC were somewhat related to the Valkyries, to the all-female battle squad of the god Odin or Wodan. Maybe they were a sort of scout for the Valkyries. So the EDC part of the EDC were captured by an enemy force. Some of the EDC are bound, others are fighting, keeping this enemy force at bay, and a third group is trying to free the bound EDC, and they would keep repeating this spell, Inspring Haftbandun, free yourselves from chains, while they were working. So easy to imagine that whole situation. The second situation is Fall and Wodan are riding with a group of women, and one of the horses gets injured. Now it's not clear whose horse it is. It says Balder's horse, and you might think Balder is the radiant god who drew the jealousy and ire of Loki, and then Loki tricked Hödur, Balder's blind brother, into killing his brother. Maybe that is Balder, indeed. But maybe Balder here also just means the Lord, and the Lord meaning Wodan. So it would be Wodan's horse, the Lord's horse, that was injured. And then it goes through. All the women try their hand at this healing spell, blood to blood, bone to bone, sinew to sinew, and their spells aren't that powerful. And then Wodan comes, and he has the most powerful of these spells, and so the horse is being healed. Now you can imagine the second one being used in a day-to-day life. When people depend on horses, a horse can get injured. Easy to imagine, and they would probably repeat that sort of spell and remind themselves of the story. And also this story attached to it is a very good teaching tool to remember that kind of spell. And there were probably those two pretty surely were not the only ones, so there would have been many more of those sort of spells. The first one, I don't know how often you're in the situation that you're being captured by a raiding party. Well, probably today less often than back then, but still back then it wasn't a daily or not even a weekly occurrence. So this other spell probably would only have been used in, well, very, very specific situations, unless of course it was a symbolic thing. Whenever you felt bound and captured and tied, you would recite that kind of spell. So there you have it. Those are two old High German magic spells for your use the next time you get captured by enemies, or the next time your horse needs some healing.